I think you should tell me how many people registered. Well, I prefer that. But I'm not really in charge most of the time. Other people are in charge. Okay. I have to find my copy of the Forgery of Venus. I thought it was in my office, but it's not. La, 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 la.
I started letting people on, Nanette.
All right, so I shouldn't say anything, untold. Is that what you're saying? Okay. We have like 12 minutes. I miss having an audience. This will be fun. This will be different. Very different. Oop. I can sit down and work on something. Nick, are you going to leave this light on back here? Oh, if you think it does, you're in charge. I'm not. I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of nice, isn't it? Is that as far over as it goes? It is, isn't it? I wish it came across. I wonder if we can do that. Oh, no, if there's a thing, if there's an entry thing to the floor, to the ceiling. The fire marshal. You have to obey the fire marshal. You do not want to be in trouble with the fire marshal, who tries to keep us all safe. Oh, those were so fun. Yeah, it was really kind of early in my, pretty early in my, let's see. Yeah, about halfway through my directorship. Oh, they were so much fun. You know what? Are you allowed to, we aren't allowed to post those, are they? Because people are we allowed to do that? Oh, we should put one on the, we should create a sort of blast from the past section of the website video thing. Because those, right, that would be fantastic. Yeah, it was great. Was it an episode where Rod played Dr. What's his name? Yeah, but he had some kind of insane name, Dr. something bottom, or it was he did such a good job. Those were so fun. There's also a video of us all doing some insane thing in the galleries. Those were good times. No. Well, didn't you tell me he could either choose to join at the beginning or join midway through or something? He doesn't. I'm sure he knows plenty about Edward Hopper. He probably doesn't need to hear me yammer on about it. Hey, Nance, they're letting people in. They're letting people in. What? I can't find my copy of Michael Gruber. It's got to be somewhere. I have a first edition hardback because we did it right after the book came out. Well, he might come. I think we don't know, but he would probably come either. He can come anytime, and you know, our poor author doesn't have to sit 40 people, which is pretty good for us, doing it remotely. All right, so here are Art Book Club 2021. These are the 4 selections of new books, and then some of you may have realized we've started adding a classic book club, which is you get to revisit a book that we read God knows how many years ago, because we've been doing the book club for a long time. We read, what I do remember is we read Michael Gruber's book when it first came out, which was really quite wonderful. It's about Velasquez, so that's really good. So let's see, we got George O'Keeffe this year. The Museum of Lost Art are Noah, I always forget how to, is it? Charney is such an interesting writer, and it's about works of art that have gone missing through time. Then we're doing Michael Gruber's book on Velasquez, and then this is an American book on American art mid-century by Arthur Hittner, who reached out to us, and we thought that was great. He's going to be on with us that night. And there is a myriad of Artemisia Gentileschi books to choose from. And we chose the novel Fierce Dreamer, which got great reviews, so we'll see how that goes. All right, so now I am in charge of my life here. Okay, and this is Lawrence Block, who is the editor of this selection of short stories. He's a really well-known writer. I love that he knew every writer that wrote for the book. He knew all of them. And he is hanging out with us a little bit tonight, and at about 1/4 or maybe 20 of 1/4, we'll have a chat with him. What we're going to do is let you, I will ask some questions, but then what we'll do is let you drop your questions into the chat. Trisha will monitor the chat so that she can bring those questions up. Nancy's here tonight. Actually, Rod and Diane are here. We actually have 3 people in the vast auditorium at the Columbus Museum of Art. So the book, of course, is on, each story is inspired by a painting by Edward Hopper. Here is a self-portrait of Edward Hopper from the late 20s. And this, I hope, for all the people at the Columbus Museum of Art, you're familiar with our wonderful Hopper, Morning Sun from 1952. It ranks up in the top 3 best traveled paintings in the community, in the collection. It's always being asked for loans. And so it's even better traveled, well, far better traveled than I am. It's a great picture. By this time, of course, after he marries his wife, Jo, she is the primary model for almost all of the women figures in his paintings. That's an odd fact that almost everybody knows about Edward Hopper, but I can't figure out why. So we brought you some just classic kind of start off to kind of ground us in Edward Hopper, in case a few of us don't know Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper is one of those artists that is able to kind of rise above the sort of like scholarship. He's someone who most Americans know. The list of American artists that most Americans know is very short, and the list of American artists that Europeans know is even shorter. Many Europeans interested in art actually do know Edward Hopper. They see Edward Hopper as sort of the quintessentially American artist. In 2004, I couriered Morning Sun to the Tate in London for the big Edward Hopper show in 2004. And it was the first retrospective of an American artist they'd ever done. And they were thrilled, and they were all in love with Edward Hopper. And it was kind of interesting too, because so I was there at the same time as the courier from the Art Institute of Chicago, who of course brought Nighthawks, right? IDOC's is Art Institute, isn't it? Yeah. And they had so many rules, I mean, understandably, so many rules around the painting that they needed a painting to put on the BBC that night. And I was the one they could talk into hanging the painting, and then that we hung the painting together, and then I went away and I came back. They took it off the wall and put it back on the wall so that the BBC could film the painting. And in honor of that, the next day when I came back, they had all changed their, like most museums, they give you internal badges so the people on the staff who are allowed in and out of an exhibition space have a specific badge for that space. And they'd all changed them to Morning Sun in honor of the Columbus Museum of Art helping with the BBC. So this is classic Hopper. This is probably one of his best known paintings, Nighthawks. It is the kind of quintessential realist picture that you associate with him. I'm going to tell you some fun details about this painting a little later in, but as a kind of iconic picture, it has that spare composition that you associate with Hopper, the sort of ambiguous narrative, which worked very well for our editor and for the many writers of the book. The whole point about Edward Hopper is it hints at it sort of the possibility of what's going on is what interests you. There's a sort of enduring quality in an Edward Hopper of the power of not knowing. You don't know what the narrative really is. Also the idea of the realism, his realism is also very much grounded in the use of light, the way he uses light. And frequently he has this preference for very, very bright light that casts very, hard, shadows that you can see. And this idea of also juxtaposing darker spaces with luminous spaces that are lit by electric lights. That's something you'll see repeat in Hopper. The thing that most people don't know about Edward Hopper is the idea that that these pictures are about loneliness and detachment and isolation. You see that written about Edward Hopper again and again and again. And yes, but no, sometimes. There does seem to be a quality about being sort of isolated in the midst of the crowd. The aloneness in the midst of an urban crowd is often implied in the pictures. But there's other ways of interpreting the pictures. And Hopper himself often said that was not his intention, to show isolation and detachment. There are always just a handful of characters or figures in the painting. Sometimes there's only one. And you often see very little communication between the figures. So those are all things that people associate with Edward Hopper. He's so well known that a number of his pictures are rife for parodies. You see them all the time. Here are two of, I don't know, Nancy and I looked at a dozen that we could have chosen. They're the one on the left, in case it's a little hard to see, are all the characters from Star Wars. The Wookiee is the waitress. And over here is Santa and all of his reindeer catching a quick bite or a quick drink, actually, before I assume going on to deliver more Christmas presents. So this idea in a Hopper that and the parodies sort of capture the fact that this is something that's part of our visual memory, our kind of visual Rolodex as Americans. But they also, Hopper's very rife for this because you kind of project onto the paintings and onto these parodies the sort of national values, anxieties, this idea of being able to transform these into being what you need to see in them. And that's true of the paintings themselves, but they also make them quite rich for parodies. The other thing that became incredibly popular during COVID, a lot of museums ran these where we ask you to pose to look like a painting at home and then send it in. We did a number of them. There is someone there posing like Morning Sun in the upper left. This is the painting by Hopper, and this is the recreation by a young woman who's posing like the figure. You'll see these were done with Hopper even before COVID, but they become very popular. Another thing that's just recently, so the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts did an exhibition on Edward Hopper and the American Hotel, and it toured, and the tour was interrupted by COVID. But when it was at its home museum, who organized it, they actually took the painting Western Motel by Hopper and created what you're seeing. These are two museum visitors looking at the recreated space of Western Motel. And not only during the exhibition could you look into that three-dimensionally recreated space, you could be one of the lucky people that 3 nights a week you were allowed to spend the night in Western Motel. They actually had a process by which people could win or pay for a chance to spend the night in Edward Hopper's recreated Western Motel. So Hopper is always, people are always doing interesting things. Again, I'm going to keep coming back. Instead of just showing you endless Edward Hoppers, I'm going to do something and then come back to a grounding in Edward Hopper. This is another extremely well-known Edward Hopper called Gas from 1940. This shows you that interest in, this is a little light for me. It actually can be a little more richly, the slide's a little light, but you see these very strong shadows that come from the building on the right that cast across it. The idea of this rural, highway, where you pass a little gas station, and the sole man, the lonely man who's running the gas station out there at the pumps. This is all, clearly classic Hopper. By 1940, Hopper actually was starting fewer pictures. He was struggling more with starting each new picture. His wife, Jo, we'll talk a little bit more about Jo Hopper in a few minutes, but he and Jo had they were married for, I think, 40 some years. They had a very tempestuous marriage, but she was critical to constantly being able to she's critical in a number of times in his career. And during this period, he wasn't very competitive, she said, and she had been trained as a painter, and she would start a painting and that would immediately get him to go back to work and start another painting. But he did struggle quite a bit with gas, but it's become one of his kind of classic images. Now, so how does Edward Hopper sort of fit into the stream of art history? The first stream that he fits into is the American realist tradition. In fact, there's an entire argument that everything that's truly American is realist art, that all the rest of it is European import. And I don't really subscribe to that, and most of you know that, but that is an argument that it is this grand realist tradition that actually goes all the way back to John Singleton Copley in the really early American colonial period. And then it comes up through Winslow Homer. This is our beautiful little Winslow Homer haymaking. Comes through Thomas Eakins. Here's the Gross Clinic. And comes up then to Bellows and to Hopper. And this is so much a part of the story of Edward Hopper that in 1956, Time magazine put Hopper on the cover. And I think that photograph, self-portrait of Hopper, might have been the cover of Time magazine. And they talked about him in 56 as this quintessential realist who represents the ongoing tradition of realism in America. So to come back again to another Edward Hopper, which is very weird because this is actually a rectangular picture. I don't know why it's doing that, but it is a rectangular picture. This is his famous New York movie from 1939. The whole point of is this pensive usherette. You can see just a few people in the audience and just the edge of the screen. When it was first, the first critical acclaim about this picture was all of the different points, all the different sources of light that are in this picture. Hopper's pictures are almost always about light in some way. And in this picture, he has all these different sources of light. That was sort of the challenge of the picture. He used a number of New York theaters. He ran around, looked at a whole bunch of theaters, and he did like 50 drawings and sketches of theaters before he started this painting. Jo is once again the model, and in this case, we know that she modeled under a light that they hung under the light in a hallway in their apartment. And that's where he painted her as the usherette. But again, this idea of you're drawn to this sort of the pensive sort of isolation of the usherette, lost in her thoughts. Another thing that came up at the time of the painting, there were critics who said that she was listless and self-absorbed because how bad American film was in 1939. I think, I don't know if I don't know enough about American film, the history of American film to agree with that, but there were critics who were very snarky about American film and said she was bored because the movies were so bad. We do know that Edward Hopper loved movies, and whenever he had a creative block, he would tend to spend all day at the movie theater. That's how he kind of got unblocked so he could paint again. So one of the things I want you to know about Edward Hopper is that he doesn't become the Edward Hopper you know until he's past 40. He's 40, 41, when he finally breaks through and gets to be Edward Hopper. Now that's important because that's why once he gets it, once he's got what he's trying to do, he stays so very close to it. In some art history circles, and I would agree with this, it's a bit of a joke that after he gets what he wants to do, he sort of paints a variant on the same picture again and again and again. But it's because it takes him so long. The struggle is so long to get to being what we think as just, Edward Hopper. So to put that in a context for you, here are several artists that if they had not become who we know them in art history and the impact they had on art history, if they hadn't become who we know them as before the age of 40, art history would be totally different. So this is Masaccio, who is, of course, the early 15th century Florentine painter who transforms Florentine painting in the Renaissance, dies at the age of 26. So if he hadn't become Masaccio before 40, we wouldn't have Masaccio. This is a detail of Raphael's School of Athens. Raphael dies at 37. His entire career that we celebrate happens before the age of 37. Peter Bruegel probably died at 39. Sometimes Renaissance artists, you're not always sure their birth dates. It's possible that he made it into his early 40s, but many people that think the great Flemish painter only lived to be 39. Toulouse-Lautrec dies at 36, so all of the Toulouse-Lautrecs are created before then. Van Gogh dies at 37, and then we can all sit here. We did Van Gogh last book, 2 book clubs ago, last book club. Last book club is Van Gogh. We got to argue about whether Van Gogh killed himself or not, but he did die at 37. And finally, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who died at the age of 27. So again, if any of these artists had taken as long to sort of get to where they were going, we would have a different art history. The other thing about Hopper that most people don't realize is that he's actually the same age as George Bellows. But when you study him in art history and you look at the arc of American painting, you never, ever see him in the chapter with George Bellows. George Bellows and he are both born, and of course, we all love George Bellows in Columbus, Ohio, because he was from here, of course. George Bellows was born in 82, and he's famous. He's already done some of his major masterpieces by 1909. Now, it's going to turn out he studies with the same teachers that Hopper does. But again, you study Bellows, and this is, of course, Columbus's Polo at Lakewood. You study him in the 1909 to the late teens. He does live into the 20s. He dies quite young. But all the great pictures by Bellows are done really in the teens. Hopper, same age. But and this is a really early Edward Hopper that looks very much like that realist moment in American painting. But Hopper, you really associate him with an entirely different group of artists, and I'm going to show you those in just a minute. So Hopper was, in fact, that's kind of weird. I'm almost thinking I should show that now. No, I got to come back to that. All right, that's what I like about the live part. I can play around. I do that less of that on Zoom. So this is a recent discovery, not a surprise, though everybody carried on about it. Surprise, surprise, Edward Hopper copied other people's art when he was young and he was learning to paint. Artists do this, printmakers do this, writers do a variant on it. We'll ask Lawrence about that. But artists they learn by painting, by practicing, by painting other painters' work. This is on the bottom is Edward Hopper. And this is Bruce Crane, who is you probably don't know Bruce Crane, but he is a known American landscape painter. And this Edward Hopper copied it as a way of learning as a teenager. He grew up in Nyack, New York. And this was literally while he was still in his teens that he was learning. His first ambition was to be an illustrator. And he actually goes to a correspondence school in New York City. and then transfers over to the New York School of Art. So by 1900, from 1900 to 1906, he was studying and then part-time teaching at the New York School of Art. He starts as an illustration, like having a major in illustration. And this is a later, so you are seeing a later illustration by Hopper. But for a number of years, he makes his living working as a part-time illustrator as a way to make enough money to live. He was actually a good illustrator. The problem is he really hated it. And as he got famous, he really hated it. And he hated when people talked about it. And then people say that his paintings were like illustrations. He really despised that. You can imagine. Edward Hopper's mature paintings are not like illustrations, but his life is, intertwined. His career is intertwined with illustration. This is a cover of a magazine. He also won a huge award in 1918 for a poster made called "Smash the Hun." Needless to say, it was a war poster. So at the New York School of Art, his first teacher is William Merritt Chase. And in honor of the fact that Edward Hopper would never want me to put William Merritt Chase in the same presentation as himself, he didn't like William Merritt Chase, and he never credited William Merritt Chase with anything. He did, however, study with Robert Henry. You see two Henrys here on the left and a photograph of Robert Henry on the right. Robert Henry is the very well-known teacher of actually a couple generations of American painters. He was a primary figure in the early career of George Bellows. He was a teacher of George Bellows. Henry, you're looking at two really great Henrys. They are really great. And there are only a handful of great Robert Henrys. I always want Robert Henry to be a better painter. But the truth, I always thought it must be painful to have taught so many good painters, great painters, and he was just a good painter himself. But he was a brilliant teacher. And certainly we would not have George Bellows without Robert Henry. The second teacher at the New York School of Art that he really took a lot away from was, again, an artist you probably never heard of, Kenneth Hayes Miller. Ken Hayes Miller, he's on the right. One of his kind of typical pictures is on the left. In 1920, he became enamored of sort of classic Renaissance painting, and he altered the way he painted, the way he did his underpainting and glazing to not mimic, it's wrong, he would hate to see me say mimic, to be inspired by or to be responsive to classic, Renaissance painting. His favorite subject was, women, particularly women on the street, contemporary, these were all contemporary, these are shoppers. And he has these very kind of classic poses and these sort of very formal compositions. And his critics always said that his pictures look like Titian's nude stuffed into, contemporary dresses, because they were always very plump and everything. But he was a masterful teacher. He not only taught Hopper, this is particularly for us who know the collection at Columbus. He taught Reginald Marsh. He taught Middleton Manigault. He taught Kuniyoshi. He taught Rockwell Kent. He even taught George Tooker. So he was one of the great teachers at the New York School of Art. Now Sloane, who is older than, he's a decade older both than Hopper and Bellows, and also is very close to Robert Henry. Sloane is in this, what we call this Henry circle of the ash can, this early realism in New York City. Henry taught them all to go out into the streets and paint. To paint the sights of New York, to paint life, to paint American life, and they're mostly in New York at this point. Sloane had a big influence, though, on Hopper. And Sloane, this is probably, for me, the Edward Hopper that is most like Sloane. Sloane and Reginald Marsh, who I didn't bring you an image of, but they were interested in American life, but they were also interested in kind of the anecdotal, the incidental. So here, he keeps the outside sign, and there's just Sloane and liked all that incidental stuff, as did Marsh. Hopper, as he matures, kind of pulls that back into this essentialism. He doesn't like all of that extra. That's that whole spare composition part of Edward Hopper, but this one's quite very much like Sloane. So he leaves the New York School of Art in '06. He goes off to Paris. He doesn't really have much money. It was a very dirt cheap sort of way of going as an art student. He goes in the fall of '06, autumn of '06, and then he stays quite a long time. He stays until like midsummer of '07. He spends most of the time in Paris. He becomes quite enamored of the Impressionists. And as a whole, Hopper really loved French culture. He read French literature, and this all through his life. He read French literature, he read symbolist poetry. He was a huge fan of Degas. So he spends a lot of time in Paris, but then right at the end of his trip, he goes to London, to Harlem, to Amsterdam, to Berlin, and Brussels. So he kind of does the sort of like the grand tour quickly to see all the art in all of those cities. He goes back to Paris for about 4 months in 1909, and then makes a last trip in 1910 very briefly and goes back to Paris again, and then runs over to Spain and gets a little bit of Spanish culture. But the truth is, after that, he seems to have never gone back to Europe. This is it. This is his European moment. And this painting is 1914, so it's, starting in the war, but it does have that sort of, Nancy and I picked it because it does kind of make you feel of that whole impress of European and particularly French culture. Most of what he was doing while he was painting was painting plein air, painting outside, partially because he didn't have much of a studio. During this period, he participates in his first group show. It's a group show with other Henry students in New York. Not much comes of it, but it's a kind of toe in the water. He finally sells his first painting in 1913 coming out of the Armory Show. This is a 1911 painting, Sailing, which he sold from the Armory Show in 1913. Now let's think about how old he is again. 1882 to 89, 82 to 92, 92 to 02, 02 to 12. So he's already he paints his painting just before he's 30, and he doesn't sell it till after he's 30. And I got to tell you, this is the only painting he will sell for the next 10 years. He has no traction with his painting. So from 1913 to 1923, he sold exactly 0 pictures after this. He does, however, discover, oops, did I screw this up? He does, however, discover etching in 1915. There's a man, he's actually an Australian painter who'd made his way over to New York. His name is Martin Lewis. You see him, this is a Martin Lewis print over on the left-hand side. And these are both from the 20s. But, and here's 2 more Hopper's etchings. But Hopper starts doing these etchings in 1915, and these are the first things he has success with. Finally, he gets some traction. He has success both with them in exhibitions and getting them accepted into exhibitions, and also selling them. So he would be able to sell etchings. But these are, of course, R20, so you're beginning to get the feel for what mature Hopper, because mature Hopper sort of emerges over the course of the 20s. The other thing that happens to him then in the early 20s is he gets back together with Josephine, here she is, Nivison. This is painted in 1906 when they were still in art school. Jo was a fellow student at the New York School of Art. She studied with Henry. They know each other then, but they sort of drift apart and really see each other again in 1923. I want to go back for 1 second. So that's 1923. But just before that, I want to tell you that I forgot one thing. So let's go back so you won't be confused. So right after he sells this is when he buys his apartment in Washington Square in Greenwich Village, where he will live essentially for the rest of his life. So he's already decided that his base will be in Greenwich Village at Washington Square. So he's moved there in 1913. This is before he reconnects with Jo. And though during this period, until those etchings start to sell, he is still working part-time as an illustrator, both in magazine work, but also for fiction. A friend of his that he'd gone to school with had started a advertising firm. He worked for him part-time. But in 23, he gets back together with Joe. They reconnect. They start a relationship that will last more than 40 years. They marry in the summer of 24. What's really important about this is that he was feeling at this point like a failure. The etchings were keeping him alive, but that is, you don't want to be a printmaker meantime. He'd had his first one-man show in 1920. It was actually at the Whitney Studio Club, which was an important site for you to have it. But I have to tell you, he sold no works out of the Whitney Studio show. He's feeling pretty much a failure. It is Joe that sets him on the course. She encourages him to take he knew how to do watercolor, but he never thought of making it like independent painting. He saw it as something he did as part of his illustration work. Joe loved watercolor, and she gets him to begin to paint in watercolor. They start spending more time out of the city. He's going to spend time, he's going to actually eventually settle in one part of, he's going to actually settle at Truro and Cape Cod eventually, but he moves around. And you can see here, Joe's watercolor on the left, Hopper's on the right. This is another Joe Hopper. This reminds me so much of a Demuth watercolor and some of his architectural studies. But you really see the beautiful facility of brushwork in an Edward Hopper. This is a painting of Joe sketching. He's in 23, right as they're getting back together. He got attention for his watercolors. So his second one-man show, and this is a masterpiece. This is a masterwork. And again, the play of light. He's very interested, even in these watercolors, in the way light works. He has his second one-man show in 1924, the fall of 24, and it's at a commercial gallery. He finally meets the dealer that he's going to work with, the gallerist he's going to work with for the rest of his life, which is Frank Wren, R-E-H-N. And Wren had great success, and he sells all of the watercolors in the show. It's like 16 watercolors. So, and he had critical success. People thought they were fantastic. And so it's really, here's one more. Now he can, look, he can go from this very wet, sort of very fluid kind of painting of watercolor to this really kind of tight watercolor. He really had quite a range in his watercolor. In the times that he spends out, particularly on Cape Cod, he loved these lighthouses. Lighthouses is a subject that's very much identified. These seascape lighthouses are very much identified with Hopper. By 1934, they had decided it was Truro, and they, in 34, built a house there. So he has a home outside the city. Okay, so classic. Here we're back to classic Hopper. Automats, everybody who's old enough to remember what an automat is? I'll let you look that up. All right, so here we are again, the light. This is that luminous, that kind of a luminous electric light, against a dark wall, or like actually going out. I think it's supposed to be a glass that you're looking out into to the night. So who is he associated with? He's not part of the Henry circle with George Bellows. It is that next generation. He is associated with the American scene, which is the dominant realist style of painting. It's a whole movement of painting. Sometimes you'll hear it called regionalism. I always prefer to call it American scene because it was across the country. It starts in the mid-20s and peaks in the 1930s. Charles Birchfield, who I spent years of my life studying, is one of those American scene painters that is really associated with the beginning in the 20s. He and Hopper are sort of father figures of the American scene in the 1920s. They also become apologists. Birchfield is a watercolorist, but he uses this opaque watercolor that people really learned that was loved, but particularly because the paintings have a kind of a weight of an oil painting, but they are opaque watercolor. This is the cover. Actually, this is the painting that was on the cover of the Birchfield book that I did years ago in my retrospective. And the joke, we tried to figure out, we did the book with Abrams. It was back when Abrams did a lot of art books. And the Abrams editor wanted this painting. And I said, but it doesn't really look so much like Charles Birchfield. It looks like Edward Hopper. And she goes, yes, everyone knows who Edward Hopper is. So that's why it's the cover of the book. They wrote about each other. Hopper wrote in 1928 an article for an arts magazine on Charles Birchfield, and then Charles Birchfield returned the favor in 1933 when Hopper had a major show at the Museum of Modern Art. So they become quite pals. But it is Birchfield, Grant Wood, John Stuart Curry, and Benton that you most associate Hopper with during this period. Now, what's going to happen is the 30s, this great trend of 30s realism is going to it's going to collide with those European modern artists that are fleeing the advance of the Nazis in Europe, coming to New York, that bringing European modernism back to New York, which is going to ultimately lead to abstract expressionism. And you can imagine that's going to be a hard period for Edward Hopper. This is one of the, there are 3 or 4 Hoppers that everybody recognizes. Now, the reason you recognize this one is that it had so much impact on film. This is the painting that inspires Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho. Psycho, the Bates mansion is based on this painting. And Charles Addams, the great cartoonist, that of course he invents the idea of the Addams family, which many people learn through movies and TV shows. But Charles Addams loved this painting. He used it as an inspiration. And then the filmmakers for the Addams Family movies used this again. And then finally, even Beetlejuice, the movie Beetlejuice, uses this painting, this house, as an inspiration for a film set. So from Psycho to Beetlejuice, this painting this image has had this house has had a lot of input. The idea is it's on a railroad track, and you see the railroad track runs down here. So the railroad track becomes a barrier, so you can't get to the house. The house is isolated, and it's supposed to look worn. It's supposed to look tired. It is a painting that is very much about, the passage of time. A lot of critics have suggested it was about people in communities being left behind, sort of being abandoned with urbanization. But again, it has that very distinctive Hopper light. This painting is done in 25. We're getting closer. Let's see, this painting is the first painting that the Museum of Modern Art buys. So this was a big sale for him. So remember, sales in 13, and then he doesn't really start selling paintings until 23. And this, within 2 years, after he starts selling paintings, he starts to get into the new Museum of Modern Art. By this time, is this modern enough? When the Museum of Modern Art bought this, there were critics that said, Hopper is too traditional. He's not really an American modernist. Is he not modern? Is he modern enough for MoMA? In 1933 is that show that Birchfield writes on about Hopper, the retrospective, and it was, again, a major show in New York for Hopper at MoMA. This, again, I think this is one of, in the top 5 Hoppers. Again, this is early Sunday morning. It's a strip of little stores in this red brick building that are along 7th Avenue. It was just a few blocks from his studio and home. In fact, the first title, Jo Hopper often names paintings. She named Nighthawks. She often gave him ideas for his titles. This painting was originally called 7th Avenue Shops. And then because of the light, the idea of this being an early morning, as the light's coming up, the idea of it being at dawn, this bleak, empty street at dawn, they changed it to early morning. And then Hopper already said somebody changed it to early Sunday morning. He didn't know where the Sunday came from. It said it didn't come from him, which I thought was interesting. We see those shadows, those very distinctive Hopper shadows. You can imagine, since Virginia did an entire show on hotel rooms, which he kind of mixed with apartment rooms. Again, these isolated figures that begin to emerge in the later 20s, all classic Hopper. And this idea that many of these are variants on the same subject, on the same theme. Look here, this is room in New York, 1932. And you kind of think like he shifted everything around and created Office at Night in 1940. This is particularly, now here you feel like you think she's at least going to make, he's ignoring her, but maybe he's going to have some communication. This here is, these two people are kind of that sense of Hopper not having people that really communicate with one another. Back to Nighthawks. A couple of things I have to tell you about Nighthawks before, as we close this presentation out. Nighthawks was actually painted in the months immediately following Pearl Harbor, the bombing at Pearl Harbor. Hopper loved to walk the streets of New York. It was one of his favorite pastimes. And you can take this as an isolated sort of, these people are being very, isolation and sort of aloneness. But there's another interpretation, and the American curator of the Artists of Chicago just wrote on this painting recently and said, this is also a perfect painting for the age of COVID, because it could also be seen as, him walking those, because what happened after Pearl Harbor, they immediately began to do the blackouts and the dimming. So the streets of New York looked very different almost within weeks. And the idea that you're walking these darkened streets and then suddenly come along this pool of light with people. For her, she thought it was insignificant that there was not just one figure, that there were four figures, as if a small community of people have come together to kind of huddle together in community in the light. And the idea of coming upon this while you're walking the darkened streets on the verge of war. It's interesting that you can take, and again, these are narratives that are hinted at. So you can take this painting in different directions. This is Joe again, and this is Hopper himself. He posed himself. There are a lot of surviving drawings, which are kind of really nice, I think, to be able to see. Studies, classic studies for, Again, here's 43 and 47. You begin to see these same recurring kind of spare compositions with just a handful of figures. This one we'll let our author talk. I hope you all read the author's note at the beginning of the book about why this was the frontispiece and why there was not a short story, and what his invitation to us is. This is, I had to bring you back Warning Sun one more time. Mostly because we found this great drawing. I wish we owned this drawing. We own the painting, but not the drawing. You won't be able to read these from home, but these are all color notes. Every single one of these. This says pink toes, cool halftone. Charles Birchfield made the same kinds of color notes on all of his drawings. I love them for that reason. In the 40s, he had a really hard time. Abstract expressionism is king. People were nice about it. They said, well, he's a classic realist. But he's holding on to he's an enduring realist working in an obsolete style, is what they said in 1950 at his second retrospective at the Whitney. But interestingly, by the third time he has a retrospective at the Whitney in 1964, pop art has emerged. Pop art and photorealist art have emerged as sort of the darlings of the art world. And suddenly Edward Hopper is seen as a forefather of current avant-garde painting. So needless to say, Hopper paid very little attention to any of this, because if you did, as an artist, you would go crazy. Finally, the last two things. These are, we talked about light, how important light is to Hopper. Look at these. There's a series of pictures at the end in the 50s and 60s, and these are very similar pictures. The same thing going on here, a sunny empty room, and then this is the view outside of his Cape Cod, his Cape Cod studio. But he really empties it out completely. He essentializes it down just to the space and light. There is a great little video of a three-dimensional recording of this painting that then has, in the middle of the recording, the shadow of a leaf falls across that wall. It's easy, just Google this and this little video will come up. It's really quite fun. But the idea of this ability to visualize the sort of internal reality of these spaces is just an amazingly haunting. Both of these pictures are incredible, focusing on the essence of seeing and perceiving. And I made it by quarter of. That is amazing. I often tell the author I'll be done at quarter of it, then I'm not. And the poor author has to think, when are we going to ever speak? I made it on time this time. The little audience applauds. All right, so Mr. Block, may I call you Lawrence? We're going to have to unmute Lawrence.
Sure.
Remember, if you have questions for him, you put it in the chat and Trisha will speak to them. We're hoping, there he is. And he's unmuted. And there he is.
And here I am.
You're there. This is a kindness. Really, it is. People have been really loving this book. So you, in the author's notes, you told us a little bit about the genesis, but you want to talk about this book and what you were doing? And
Well, I don't know exactly what there is to say, probably not a tremendous amount. The idea just came to me. I don't remember what I was doing, but I was sitting around one day and I suddenly thought, I was thinking about Hopper. I'd read some of Gail Levin's biography of Hopper, and of course I'd been to a few shows locally. And I thought that, I thought for a moment that the paintings have stories, and then I corrected that because I realized that what really happens in a Hopper painting, as far as I'm concerned, is not that there's a story there to be told, but one senses that there is a story lurking there somewhere. And I thought, gee, an anthology of stories linked to Hopper paintings might go rather nicely. And the title for the book came to me almost immediately. I don't know why, but it did, In Sunlight or in Shadow. And I sent out a letter to a list of writers whom I really hoped might be interested. And a remarkable number of them responded favorably. You know, most of the time, asking a writer to write something for an anthology is asking a favor, really. There's nothing in it for the writer particularly. And so it only works insofar as it's a labor of love. But the number of writers who would say that Hopper was a favorite painter of theirs is remarkably high. Gail Levin, who's his biographer and I believe compiled the Catalogue Raisonné, she has a couple of books consisting of references she came across in fiction where writers talk about Hopper paintings, and quite a few of them, and another collection of poetry that's related to it. Anyway, things went very, very well.
did you let them pick the paintings? Did you let them say pick a favorite Hopper painting? Did you approach it that way?
I said just pick a Hopper painting and let me know what it is, so that nobody else picks it, and people did, and the stories are superb. You know, I expected nothing less of the writers involved, but I thought they were very, very good. And the book wound up beautiful. Now, no publisher wants to do an anthology. It's a pain in the neck. And and my agent was wonderfully persistent and kept going. And finally we found Claiborne Hancock at Pegasus turned out to be the perfect publisher for the book. And it all came together, you know, and I'm delighted. I did 2 more art-based anthologies since then. One is called Alive in Shape and Color, where people just picked a painting. And then the third volume is From Sea to Stormy Sea. And that one, I picked about 30 paintings for people to choose among. And they're all by American artists. So that's the hook with that book. And I doubt I'll do any more art-based anthologies. I think they turned out wonderfully well, but it's a tremendous amount of work, and you have to
It's
get.
a lot of work, isn't it?
Oh,
Well, I
it's
we
far.
share one writer with you, and that is Joyce Carol Oates. We have published, we got a grant for a catalog of our American collection that went way too long. I mean, the lesson was don't take 12 years to do a book when you keep collecting, because we kept updating. But we asked the whole point of the book was to ask not just art historians, but to ask different people from different fields to write. And of course, everyone knows how much Joyce Carol Oates loves bellows, and much to our delight and surprise, she did one of the catalog entries on George Bellows. So to read her short story here really was quite wonderful.
Well, Joyce with her passion for boxing, Bellows would be a natural for her, of course. That Bellows painting that you showed, it turns up in From Sea to Stormy Sea. Barry Maltzberg did a story off that. I don't know if it was that painting or a different painting of Bellows. I may be wrong about that, but it came out rather nicely.
Tricia, do you have any questions in the chat?
We do. So one of our docents is asking, why do you think so many of the stories are creepy or violent?
Okay, Lawrence, why are so many of the stories creepy or violent?
Well, a fair percentage of the invited writers are identified largely with the mystery crime fiction field. So that would probably predispose them to writing stories that are creepy or violent. Also, both of those adjectives are somewhat subjective. I don't know that everyone would characterize the stories exactly the same way.
I don't think we went on to tell Stephen King it was creepy and violent. Anything? What else, Tricia?
Diane is asking, well, it's more of a comment. Would love to see the CMA members write their own stories for some of these pictures. She's always loved Hopper paintings, but this book helped her view Hopper paintings in a deeper way. So she thanks you. And Patricia Callis is asking, did you edit the stories at all or just publish as received?
I didn't do any real editing beyond formatting. I may have made a suggestion to one writer or another, but I'm not. Since I'm so loath to be edited myself, I'm not inclined to edit anyone else if I can avoid it.
That's a good reason. Well, it was real. I loved that the fact. I was kind of sad, of course, that the one writer's wasn't able to complete the story on Cape Cod Morning, but I love the solution, which was in your author's kind of preface to invite others now, for the readers to write their own story inspired by Cape Cod Morning, which I thought was the perfect solution, and making it the frontispiece was quite wonderful. So other questions?
Patricia asked again, please say a few words about your story.
Oh, about the story that you wrote, Lawrence, your particular story.
Oh, sure. The story I wrote is, I think you showed the particular painting. It was Automat. I think the title of the story was Autumn at the Automat. And it was
Whoop, we froze.
Because I knew I really ought to write a story myself for the anthology. And I couldn't think, wasn't struck by anything. And then I was looking at that painting and got a full idea for a story that would only work with that painting. But however, Christine Catherine Roosh had already declared dibs on that one. So I wrote her and said, did you have something very much in mind? Have you started it or anything? And she said, no, I just had to pick one. So I picked that. If you want to take it, you're welcome to it. So I was delighted to be able to do that. And the story was derived from a bit of urban folklore that I'd heard long ago about a woman who was made an example of her purse at a automat, and it turned out it was her own silverware because she wouldn't use their trashy flatware herself. And after that, I was given to understand that every automat in New York was under strict instructions that if anyone was putting silverware in their bag, just leave them the hell alone, because the settlement that she got from them was substantial. But this is anyway. That was the source ultimately of the story.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, one of the things we always ask our writers and authors when they join us is, would you like to tell us what you're working on right now? Something that sometimes authors will say, "Oh, we'll share it." Others are like, "No, I never discuss anything while it's in progress."
I'm very close to being retired at this point, but
Ah.
I do have something in the works, and it's been in the works for a very, very long time. Most of the time it was not so much in the works as on a shelf, but it's a memoir of my beginnings as a writer. The first, I don't know how many years, but I had written a large section of it in white heat about 30 years ago. And then I set it aside for about ever since. And about 6 or 8 months ago, I picked it up again. And it's an interesting memoir in that, to me, I don't know if it'll be of any interest to anybody else, but since I will self-publish it, I don't care if anybody else likes it. We will see. I think the title will be A Writer Prepares.
A writer prepares. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, is there any last questions in the chat, Tricia, before we say good evening to our author?
There are no additional questions unless
All right.
anyone has any more.
Give people
That's
a minute. But
enough.
Lawrence, this was a kindness. I mean, it really excites. This book club's been going on for a long time. We do it twice, and we usually, when we're able to gather, we usually get about 100 people between the two sessions. And I remember years ago, the classic book club that we're going to do pretty soon with Martin Gruber's what is it called, the Forgery of Venus. It was a really long ago, and I remember we were talking. This time we were just way before Zoom. We were just talking on the phone, and people were asking questions. And there was this long silence. He goes, "How many people are in that room?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. There's about 60 people, 40 people." And he said, "Did they all read the book?" I said, "Yes, they did." And he said, "Did they buy it?" And I said, "Now they didn't all buy it. Some of them went to the library." I said, "But many people go, 'No, we bought it.'" He goes, "Oh, thank God." And he was just so pleased that 40 or 50 people would gather in a room to talk about this was long ago, but I'll never forget that. And he's like, "Did they all read it? Did they buy it?"
That's marvelous. Well, thank you very much
Thank
for this.
you. This was a kindness.
And let me
Take
tell you,
care. Stay safe.
okay, and I enjoyed your presentation very, very much, by the way.
Thanks. Well, it's kind of art history light. So take care, sir.
Bye now.
All right. I think that's it for us. Thank you for joining us. And eventually, maybe late spring, maybe summer, we'll all be back together in person. But till then, hang in there and we'll all have Art Book Club by remote. Take care.